Memphis, Tennessee. Summer had arrived early in 1961. The streets were warm beneath the afternoon sun, and the sidewalks seemed to shimmer beneath the heat. Old cars rolled slowly past rows of modest houses, their windows lowered as people searched for a little relief from the heavy air. But on one quiet neighborhood street, nobody seemed to care about the heat. There was a celebration. It wasn't a grand event. There were no television cameras, no reporters, no velvet ropes, just families gathered beneath the trees, children running across the grass, women carrying plates of food, and colorful balloons floating above the crowd. Someone had brought a small speaker. Someone else had brought a folding table covered with homemade cakes. And at the center of it all was a bundle of balloons, red, blue, white, pink, and yellow, bobbing gently against the summer sky. Among the crowd stood a 7-year-old boy named Tommy. He wasn't running with the other children. He wasn't laughing when they laughed. He wasn't turning his head when someone called his name. Tommy stood beside his mother, Margaret, holding her hand tightly. He was watching the balloons. One balloon in particular, a bright yellow one. He pointed at it. His mother followed his finger. Then she looked down at him. Margaret smiled sadly. She knew exactly what he wanted. But there was a problem. The balloons were being handed out from the other side of the crowd, and a long line of children had already formed. Margaret looked into her purse. There were only a few coins inside. She counted them twice. Then she quietly closed the purse. Tommy pointed again. The yellow balloon. Margaret knelt beside him. She touched his shoulder and shook her head gently. Tommy understood. His smile disappeared. He lowered his hand. He didn't cry. That almost broke her heart, more than if he had. Because Tommy had learned something at a very young age. Sometimes asking for something only made his mother feel guilty. So he had stopped asking. Margaret pulled him closer. Across the street, a dark automobile slowly came to a stop. Nobody noticed at first. Then a few people turned. A woman whispered something to another woman. A man stopped eating. Someone near the sidewalk suddenly said, "Is that?" The crowd began to shift. A tall man stepped out of the car. Dark hair, dark shirt, familiar face. For a few seconds, people simply stared. It was Elvis Presley. In 1961, Elvis didn't need an introduction. His name was already known across America. But that afternoon, he wasn't there for a concert. He wasn't there for television. He wasn't there to perform. He had come quietly, hoping to spend a little time at a neighborhood charity gathering without turning the entire afternoon into a spectacle. But the moment people recognized him, whispers spread through the crowd. Elvis smiled politely. He lifted one hand. Then he looked toward the children. And that's when he saw Tommy. Not because Tommy was shouting, not because he was trying to get Elvis's attention, but because every other child was moving. And Tommy wasn't. Elvis watched him for several seconds. Then his eyes followed Tommy's gaze. The yellow balloon. Elvis smiled. He walked toward him. Margaret immediately became nervous. She knew who Elvis was. Everyone did. But she didn't know why he was walking toward her son. Elvis stopped a few feet away. He lowered himself onto one knee. Tommy looked at him. Elvis pointed toward the yellow balloon. Then he pointed toward Tommy. He smiled. "You want that one?" Tommy didn't react. Elvis repeated himself. Still nothing. Margaret's face changed. She realized what was happening. She leaned toward Elvis. "He's deaf." Elvis looked at Tommy again. For a moment, the noise of the celebration seemed to disappear. The children were still laughing. The music was still playing, people were still talking, but Elvis wasn't looking at any of them. He was looking at the little boy in front of him. Tommy was looking at Elvis's lips, trying to understand. Elvis slowly pointed at the balloon again. Then he made a simple gesture with his hands. "You want it?" Tommy nodded. A tiny smile appeared, and Elvis smiled back. He stood. Then he walked toward the balloons. The woman holding them looked surprised. Elvis reached into his pocket. "How much for the whole bunch?" The woman laughed nervously. "The whole bunch?" Elvis nodded. "Yeah." A few people nearby began laughing, but Elvis wasn't joking. He paid for every balloon. Then he took the enormous bundle of strings in one hand. The balloons rose above him like a colorful cloud. He walked back toward Tommy. The little boy's eyes became enormous. Elvis knelt again. Instead of giving him one balloon, he placed the entire bundle into Tommy's hands. Tommy looked at his mother. Margaret covered her mouth. She wasn't expecting this. She shook her head slowly. "That's too much." Elvis smiled. "It's all right." Tommy looked down at the strings, then up at Elvis. He smiled, and for the first time that afternoon, he laughed. He couldn't hear his own laughter, but he could feel it. Elvis noticed, and something about that moment stayed with him. He could have simply walked away. The boy had his balloons. The problem was solved. But Elvis kept watching Tommy. There was something in the boy's expression that didn't seem quite complete. Tommy had wanted the yellow balloon, but now he had dozens. And yet his eyes kept drifting toward the small speaker nearby. The music was playing. Children were dancing. Tommy watched them. He watched their feet. He watched their hands. He watched the way they moved when the music changed. He couldn't hear any of it, but he could see the joy. And Elvis understood. The balloons weren't really what Tommy wanted. They were simply something he could experience with his eyes. Elvis looked at Margaret. "What does he like?" Margaret hesitated. She looked at her son, then back at Elvis. "Music." Elvis's expression softened. "He likes music?" Margaret nodded. "He loves it." She swallowed. "He just can't hear it." Elvis looked at Tommy again. The boy was holding the balloons tightly. Then Elvis glanced toward the musicians. A guitar was resting against a chair. And suddenly, an idea came into his mind. Quick viewer poll. Before we continue, tell us what you would have done. If you were Elvis, would you have simply given Tommy the balloon? Or stayed to find another way to make him feel the music? Like this story, if you believe small acts of kindness can change someone's life. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from, your city and country. And if you enjoy emotional stories like this, subscribe so you don't miss the next moment. Elvis walked toward the guitar. He picked it up. A few people immediately noticed. Someone whispered, "Is he going to play?" Another person reached for a camera. Elvis shook his head gently. He wasn't interested in putting on a show. He walked back toward Tommy. Tommy looked at the guitar. His eyes followed Elvis's hands. Elvis sat down on the grass. Then he looked at Tommy. He tapped the body of the guitar. Once. Twice. Tommy watched. Elvis placed his hand over Tommy's. He gently guided the boy's fingers toward the wooden surface. Then he played one chord. Tommy froze. He couldn't hear the sound, but he felt something. A vibration. A faint trembling beneath his fingertips. His eyes widened. Elvis played another chord. Tommy looked down at his hand. Then at Elvis. Another chord. The boy's expression changed. He had discovered something completely new. Music didn't have to enter through his ears. It could travel through his fingertips. It could move through wood. It could become a vibration beneath his skin. Elvis watched Tommy's face, and then Tommy smiled. Not the polite smile he had given the adults. Not the smile children gave when someone handed them candy. This was different. It was wonder. Pure wonder. Margaret stared at her son. Her eyes slowly filled with tears. Elvis kept playing, very softly. He wasn't performing for the crowd. He was playing for one child. The people nearby became quiet. The children stopped running. Even the adults stopped talking. Everyone watched. Tommy's hand remained against the guitar. Each time Elvis struck a chord, Tommy felt the vibration. The boy began moving his fingers. He was trying to understand the rhythm. Elvis noticed. He slowed down. Tommy moved his hand again. Elvis followed. It almost looked like the two of them were having a conversation. But there were no words, only movement, only vibration, only a child discovering that maybe the world wasn't as silent as he had always believed. Margaret wiped her eyes. Elvis looked up at her. "He's feeling it," he said softly. Margaret nodded. "He always wanted to." Elvis looked back at Tommy. "How old is he?" 7. Elvis smiled. 7. He repeated the number as though he couldn't quite believe how young the boy was. Then Tommy reached into his pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. Margaret immediately looked embarrassed. "Tommy," but Tommy handed it to Elvis. Elvis unfolded it. There were only a few words written in uneven handwriting. Elvis read them. His expression changed. The paper said, "I want to know what music feels like." Elvis stared at the sentence. He read it again. Then once more. For several seconds, he said nothing. The crowd remained silent. Margaret began crying. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Elvis looked up. "Don't apologize." She shook her head. I wish I could give him what he wants." Elvis folded the paper carefully. He handed it back to Tommy. Then he looked at the boy. He pointed toward the guitar. Then toward Tommy. He made a simple gesture. "You." Tommy didn't understand immediately. Elvis smiled. He placed the guitar carefully into Tommy's hands. The boy looked frightened. He looked at his mother. Margaret immediately said, "No, honey. It's okay." Elvis gently positioned Tommy's fingers. Then he helped him touch the strings. Tommy plucked one. The string moved. He couldn't hear the note, but he felt the vibration. His eyes filled with excitement. He plucked it again, then again. Elvis laughed softly. Tommy laughed too. And Margaret finally broke down. She turned away from the crowd and covered her face. Because in that moment, she wasn't crying, because she was sad. She was crying because her son had just discovered something she had feared he might never experience. Music. Not the way everyone else experienced it, but his way. Elvis noticed Margaret crying. He stood and walked toward her. "You don't have to be ashamed of anything," he told her. She looked at him through her tears. "He just wants to be like everybody else." Elvis shook his head. "Maybe he doesn't have to be." Margaret stared at him. Elvis looked back at Tommy. "Maybe everybody else needs to learn how to see things the way he does." The words hit her harder than anything else that afternoon. She looked at her son. Tommy was still holding the guitar, still smiling, still feeling every tiny vibration. And Elvis suddenly realized something. Giving the boy a balloon had been easy. But perhaps the balloon had only been the beginning. Because Tommy didn't need someone to feel sorry for him. He needed someone to believe that he could still have a dream. Elvis walked back to him. He crouched beside him. Then he pointed toward the guitar. He pointed toward Tommy. And then he pointed toward himself. It was a promise, without words. Elvis wasn't finished. Not even close. The afternoon sun began to fall behind the trees, the balloons floated above them, and somewhere in that quiet Memphis neighborhood, a 7-year-old boy who couldn't hear music was beginning to discover what it meant to feel it. But neither Tommy nor his mother knew that Elvis had already made a decision that would change what happened next. And when Margaret discovered what Elvis planned to do, she would cry harder than she had all afternoon. Next morning, Margaret woke up thinking the previous afternoon had been a dream. The balloons were still tied beside Tommy's bed. Some had slowly lost their shape overnight, hanging lower than they had the day before. The bright yellow one Tommy had wanted was still floating above his pillow. Tommy was awake. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the guitar Elvis had placed in his hands. Tommy reached out and touched the strings. He plucked one, then another. He watched the strings move. He pressed his fingertips against the wooden body. He was learning the instrument in a way no teacher had ever shown him. Not through sound, through touch. Margaret stood in the doorway. She watched silently. Then Tommy looked up. He smiled. He pointed at the guitar. Then he pointed toward the front door. Margaret understood. He wanted to see Elvis again. She knelt beside him. "Tommy, honey, people like Elvis don't usually come back." Tommy frowned. He didn't understand the words, but he understood her expression. He looked down at the guitar, then at the yellow balloon. He touched the string attached to it. For the first time, Margaret realized something. Tommy wasn't expecting Elvis to return because Elvis was famous. He was expecting him to return because, for one brief afternoon, someone had understood him. That was something Tommy had rarely experienced. Across Memphis, Elvis was already awake. The previous afternoon had stayed in his mind. The boy, the balloons, the guitar, and especially that sentence on the piece of paper. "I want to know what music feels like." Elvis had seen thousands of people screaming at concerts. He had watched crowds cry. He had seen fans fight for a chance to touch his hand. He had received expensive gifts, letters, photographs, flowers. But that little handwritten sentence bothered him. Not because it was sad, because it was hopeful. Tommy wasn't asking Elvis to cure him. He wasn't asking to hear. He simply wanted to experience music. And Elvis couldn't stop thinking about it. He called someone he trusted. "I need a favor." The man on the other end asked what kind. "I need to find out where that kid lives." There was silence. "Which kid?" "The boy from yesterday." "The deaf boy?" "Yeah." Elvis paused. "And I need a guitar teacher." The man laughed. "A guitar teacher? Someone patient." "Elvis, you're serious?" "I'm serious." He looked toward the guitar case beside him. "Find someone who knows how to teach through rhythm and vibration. Someone who won't treat him like he's broken." That last sentence mattered, because Elvis didn't want Tommy to be treated like a child who couldn't do something. He wanted someone to show Tommy what he could do. By late afternoon, Elvis had found a teacher. Her name was Miss Eleanor Hayes. She had spent years teaching children music. She had never taught a deaf child before. When Elvis explained what he wanted, she hesitated. "I don't know if I can do this." Elvis looked at her. "Neither do I." She smiled. "Then why ask me?" "Because you're willing to try." Eleanor looked at the guitar, then back at Elvis. "What exactly do you expect?" Elvis answered quietly. "Nothing." She raised an eyebrow. "Nothing?" "I don't want him to become a musician." Elvis paused. "I just want him to know that he can." That evening, Elvis returned to Margaret's neighborhood. This time, There was no crowd, no announcement, no celebration, no photographers, just a black car pulling quietly toward the curb. Margaret was hanging laundry outside when she saw it. Her heart stopped. She wiped her hands on her dress. Elvis stepped out. Margaret stared. "Mr. Presley?" He smiled. "Call me Elvis." She looked toward the house. Tommy was inside. "He hasn't stopped talking about you." Elvis smiled. "He talks?" Margaret laughed through a small smile. "With his hands." Elvis nodded. "That's enough." Tommy suddenly appeared at the doorway. He saw Elvis. His face lit up. He ran outside. The guitar was still hanging around his shoulder. Elvis crouched down. Tommy immediately placed his hand against Elvis's arm. Then he pointed toward the guitar. Elvis smiled. "You've been practicing." Tommy nodded enthusiastically. Then he played the same string he had learned the day before. Elvis applauded. Tommy laughed. Margaret watched them. Then Elvis looked at her. "I found someone." Margaret didn't understand. "Someone?" "A teacher." Her expression changed. "For Tommy?" Elvis nodded. Margaret immediately shook her head. "No, we can't afford—" "I didn't say anything about money." She stopped. Elvis continued. "I want him to have lessons." Margaret looked down. She couldn't speak. Elvis could see the embarrassment on her face, so he said something that changed everything. "This isn't charity." Margaret looked up. "It's not?" "No." He pointed toward Tommy. "It's an opportunity." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Elvis continued. "And if he decides after one lesson that he hates the guitar?" He smiled. "Then I'll buy him a bicycle." Tommy looked at them. He had no idea what they were discussing. But he saw his mother's tears. He walked toward her. He touched her cheek. Margaret pulled him into her arms. Elvis looked away for a moment. He knew this family didn't need pity. They needed dignity. The first lesson took place 2 days later. Eleanor arrived carrying a small wooden box. Tommy sat across from her. He looked nervous. She didn't begin with music. She began with rhythm. She placed the box on the floor. Then she tapped it. Once, twice, 3 times. Tommy watched. She tapped again. Tommy placed his hand on the wood. Eleanor tapped. Tommy felt it. She waited. Then Tommy tapped back. Eleanor smiled. Again. Tommy responded. Again. This time Tommy laughed. He had just discovered rhythm, not through his ears, through his hands. Eleanor looked at Margaret. Margaret was crying. Again. But this time, Eleanor understood. She was watching a child discover a language he had always been told he couldn't speak. A language made of vibration, movement, timing, touch, and patience. Elvis wasn't there for the entire lesson. He stood outside the room for several minutes. He watched through the window. Tommy was smiling. Eleanor tapped the box. Tommy answered. The rhythm became faster, then slower. Tommy followed. Elvis smiled. But something unexpected happened. Tommy suddenly stopped. He looked toward the window. He had noticed Elvis. Elvis raised his hand. Tommy smiled. Then he pointed toward the guitar. Elvis entered. Tommy held out the instrument. He wanted Elvis to hear what he had learned. Elvis took the guitar. He played a slow chord. Then another. He placed Tommy's hand against the guitar. Tommy felt it. Then Tommy tapped his fingers against the guitar body. 1, 2, 3. Elvis followed his rhythm. Tommy tapped again. Elvis followed. Soon, the two were creating something together. It wasn't a song. Not yet. But it was music. Their own kind of music. Viewer poll. Stop for a moment and tell us what you think. If you were Tommy's mother, Would you accept Elvis's offer to pay for the lessons? If you believe every child deserves a chance to chase a dream, hit the like button. Comment yes if you would accept the help. And don't forget to tell us where you're watching from, your city and country. Subscribe if you want to hear the emotional ending of Tommy and Elvis's story. Weeks passed. Tommy practiced every day. He learned how to recognize different rhythms through vibration. He learned where to place his fingers. He learned how to feel the difference between a soft note and a strong one. But he still couldn't hear the music, and that bothered him. One afternoon, Tommy became frustrated. He threw the guitar onto the bed. Margaret rushed toward him. Tommy shook his head. He pointed toward the guitar. Then he pointed toward his ears. Then he shook his head. Margaret understood. He wanted to know what everyone else heard. He wanted to know what Elvis heard. She sat beside him. She held his hand. "I know." Tommy looked at her. She couldn't explain something she herself couldn't fix. Then Tommy pointed toward the paper. The same paper. "I want to know what music feels like." Margaret hugged him. And that night, she wrote Elvis a letter. She thanked him, but she also told him the truth. Tommy was happy. Sometimes he was angry. Sometimes he wondered why he couldn't hear. Sometimes he wondered whether music would always belong to everyone else. Elvis received the letter the next morning. He read it slowly. Then he folded it. He sat quietly for several minutes. Finally, he picked up the telephone. "I want to see him." Elvis arrived that afternoon. Tommy was sitting on the porch. He saw the car. He stood immediately. Elvis walked toward him. Tommy pointed at the guitar. Elvis nodded. Then Tommy pointed at his ears. Elvis understood. He sat beside him. For a while, neither moved. Then Elvis took Tommy's hand. He placed it against his own throat. Elvis spoke one word. "Feel." Tommy looked confused. Elvis spoke again. "Feel." He said it slowly. Tommy felt the vibration in Elvis's throat. His eyes widened. Elvis smiled. Then he placed Tommy's hand against the guitar. He played. Tommy felt the vibration. Then Elvis placed Tommy's hand against the wooden porch. He stomped his foot. Tommy felt the vibration beneath the floor. Elvis pointed toward the trees. The leaves moved. The balloons moved. The world was full of vibrations. Tommy suddenly looked around. His expression changed. Elvis was showing him something. He wasn't missing everything. He was experiencing the world differently. Elvis pointed at Tommy's chest, then at the guitar. Then he smiled. Tommy slowly smiled back. For the first time, he seemed to understand. Maybe music wasn't something he had lost. Maybe music was something he was learning to discover in his own way. But then Elvis noticed something on the porch. A small cardboard box. Inside was Tommy's old, broken toy guitar. The strings were missing. The body was cracked. Tommy had apparently kept it for years. Elvis picked it up. He examined it. Then he looked at Margaret. "Why does he keep this?" Margaret smiled sadly. "Because it was his first guitar." Elvis looked at the broken instrument, then at Tommy. And suddenly, another idea entered his mind. An idea much bigger than a balloon. Much bigger than one guitar lesson. He had no idea yet how much this decision would change Tommy's life. And when Tommy eventually saw what Elvis had prepared for him, he wouldn't know whether to laugh or cry. Neither would his mother. Next morning, Tommy woke before sunrise. He didn't know why. Something felt different. Perhaps it was because Elvis had promised nothing and yet somehow given him more than anyone ever had. A guitar, a teacher, a new way to understand rhythm. But there was still something inside Tommy that bothered him. He wanted to play. He wanted to feel music. He wanted to make something that belonged to him And more than anything, he wanted to show Elvis that he could do it. Tommy climbed out of bed. He picked up the guitar. He sat beside the window. The neighborhood was still quiet. No cars, no children, no voices. Tommy placed his fingers against the strings. He played the rhythm Eleanor had taught him. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3. He made a mistake. He started again. Another mistake. Again. He didn't give up. For nearly an hour, he practiced. Then he noticed something outside. A familiar black car. Tommy jumped up. Elvis had returned. But this time, Elvis wasn't alone. He stepped out of the car carrying something large. It was wrapped in a brown blanket. Tommy ran outside. Elvis smiled. "Mornin', partner." Tommy pointed at the bundle. Elvis laughed. "Yeah, that's for you." Margaret came outside. She immediately became nervous. "What is that?" Elvis looked at her. "You'll see." He placed the bundle carefully on the porch. Then he removed the blanket. Margaret froze. Tommy stared. It was a guitar, but not an ordinary guitar. It was a beautifully finished instrument, carefully fitted for a young player. Elvis had arranged for it to be modified so Tommy could feel its vibrations more clearly. The body had been reinforced. The strings were set up for easier playing. And beneath the wooden surface, Elvis had arranged a simple vibration system connected to the instrument. When the strings were played, the vibration could be felt through the body of the guitar. Tommy reached toward it. He didn't touch it immediately. He looked at Elvis, then at his mother. Margaret covered her mouth. "Elvis." He shook his head. "Don't." She looked confused. "Don't thank me." He pointed toward Tommy. "Thank him." Tommy looked up. Elvis smiled. He worked for it. Tommy touched the guitar. His fingers trembled. Elvis helped him hold it. Tommy plucked a string. The vibration traveled beneath his fingertips. His face changed. He played another, then another. Soon he was smiling. He hugged the guitar against his chest. Margaret began crying. Again. Elvis looked at her. She laughed through her tears. "I'm sorry." Elvis smiled. "I think you're allowed." Tommy suddenly put the guitar down. He ran toward the house. He returned holding the broken toy guitar, the one Elvis had seen on the porch. He placed the broken instrument beside the new one. Then he looked at Elvis. He pointed toward the old guitar, then toward the new one. He was asking something. Elvis understood. He crouched beside him. "You don't have to throw that one away." Tommy smiled. Elvis picked up the broken guitar. "We can fix it." Tommy's eyes widened. Margaret laughed. "You really don't have to do that." Elvis looked at her. "I know." He turned toward Tommy. "But maybe we should." A week later, Tommy's old toy guitar came back. It looked almost completely different. The broken body had been repaired. The missing strings had been replaced. The scratches remained. Elvis had insisted they stay. He didn't want the instrument to look new. He wanted Tommy to remember where he had started. When Tommy saw it, he immediately grabbed it. He looked at Elvis, then at the repaired guitar, then at the new guitar. He smiled. Elvis pointed at the old instrument. "That's where you started." Then he pointed at the new one. "That's where you're going." Tommy didn't understand every word, but he understood the gesture. He held both guitars close. Margaret stood behind him. She watched her son. For years, she had worried about what Tommy would not be able to do. Now she was watching someone teach him to think about what he could. And Elvis wasn't finished. He had one more surprise. Several days later, Eleanor arrived early. She told Margaret to dress Tommy nicely. Tommy didn't understand why. He kept pointing toward the guitar. Eleanor smiled. "You're going somewhere." Tommy looked confused. The car arrived. Tommy climbed in. Margaret sat beside him. Elvis was waiting. They drove for several minutes. Finally, they stopped outside a small music studio. Tommy looked through the window. Inside was a room filled with instruments, drums, pianos, guitars, and a large wooden floor. Elvis opened the door. Tommy stepped inside. He looked around. Then he saw several musicians. They smiled at him. One man approached. He knelt. He tapped his foot against the floor. Boom! Tommy felt it. The man tapped again. Boom! Tommy smiled. Then another musician struck a drum. The vibration traveled across the room. Tommy's eyes widened. Elvis stood behind him. He watched. This wasn't a concert. There was no audience, no applause, no cameras, just musicians who had agreed to let a little boy experience music in a different way. One musician played a bass note. Tommy placed his hand on the wooden floor. He felt it. Another played a guitar. Tommy touched the guitar body. He felt another vibration. Then the drummer began a steady rhythm. Tommy closed his eyes. He couldn't hear, but he could feel. The floor, the air, the wood, his hands, his chest. Everything seemed to move. And for the first time, Tommy wasn't watching other people experience music. He was inside it. Elvis watched him. His eyes became wet. He turned away for a moment. Eleanor noticed. She smiled. "You did something good." Elvis shook his head. "No." He looked back at Tommy. "He did." Viewer poll. Before we reach the final moment, tell us honestly, do you think Elvis changed Tommy's life that day? Or did Tommy change Elvis's life too? Hit like if you believe kindness can come back to us in unexpected ways. Comment kindness if you believe every child deserves someone who believes in them. And tell us where you're watching from. Write your city and country in the comments. Subscribe if you want more emotional stories like this. The musicians continued playing. Tommy moved his hands across the floor. Then something unexpected happened. He began tapping. 1, 2, 3, 4. The drummer stopped. Everyone looked at Tommy. Tommy tapped again. 1, 2, 3, 4. The drummer smiled. He followed Tommy's rhythm. Tommy looked surprised. He tapped again. The drummer followed. Tommy tapped faster. The drummer followed. Elvis looked at Eleanor. Eleanor whispered, "He's leading them." Elvis smiled. Tommy wasn't following the music. He was creating rhythm. The musicians began building around him. The bass joined. Then the guitar. Then the drums. Tommy stood in the middle of the room. His hands moved. His feet moved. He could feel everything. And suddenly, the little boy who had once stood silently beside his mother at a neighborhood celebration was leading a room full of musicians. Margaret watched from the doorway. She couldn't breathe. Tears rolled down her face. She remembered the yellow balloon, her son's tiny hand reaching toward it. She remembered telling him they couldn't afford one. She remembered how quietly he had accepted disappointment. And now, he was standing in a music studio surrounded by musicians. Not because someone felt sorry for him, because someone believed in him. Elvis walked over. He crouched beside Tommy. Tommy looked at him. Elvis pointed toward the musicians, then toward Tommy. He gave him a thumbs up. Tommy smiled. Then he pointed toward Elvis, and he made a gesture. A simple one. He placed his hand over his heart. Elvis's smile disappeared for a moment. He understood. "Thank you." Elvis put his hand over his own heart. Then he hugged the boy. Margaret turned away. She cried, but this time she didn't hide it. Later that evening, they returned home. The sun was setting over Memphis. The sky was orange. The neighborhood was quiet. Tommy carried his guitar. He walked beside Elvis. Before Elvis got into his car, Tommy stopped him. He ran inside. A few moments later, he returned carrying a sheet of paper. He handed it to Elvis. Elvis unfolded it. There was a drawing. It showed two people. One was Tommy. The other was Elvis. Above them was a large yellow balloon. And underneath the drawing were four simple words. "You taught me music." Elvis stared at the paper. He swallowed hard. Then he looked at Tommy. "You know something?" Tommy watched his lips. Elvis pointed toward the boy. "You taught me something, too." Tommy waited. Elvis touched his heart, then pointed toward Tommy. "Listen differently." Tommy smiled. Elvis folded the drawing carefully. He put it into his jacket pocket. He didn't give it to anyone. He kept it. Months passed. Tommy continued practicing. He became better, much better. He could recognize rhythms through vibration. He could follow patterns. He could play simple melodies. He could feel when a string was vibrating differently. Eleanor told Margaret that Tommy had something special, not because he was deaf, but because he paid attention to things other people ignored. The smallest changes in vibration, the movement of fingers, the rhythm of footsteps, the trembling of wood, the pulse beneath his fingertips. Tommy had learned to turn silence into another kind of language. And Elvis never forgot him. Every once in a while, a letter arrived. Sometimes there was no letter, just a photograph. Tommy holding his guitar. Tommy practicing. Tommy smiling beside Eleanor. And one photograph showed Tommy standing in front of the old neighborhood house. The yellow balloon was tied beside him. Years later, Margaret would still remember that first day. The day her son wanted something simple. One yellow balloon. She had thought the story was about a famous man giving a child a gift. She eventually realized it was about something much bigger. The balloon wasn't the gift. The guitar wasn't the gift. Even the lessons weren't the greatest gift. The greatest gift was being seen. Someone had looked at Tommy and refused to see a limitation. Elvis had seen a child who wanted to experience the world, and instead of saying, "He can't," he asked, "How can we?" One final afternoon, Elvis visited Tommy again. Tommy was older now. He stood on the porch, holding his guitar. Elvis walked toward him. Tommy smiled. They sat together. No crowd, no cameras, no balloons. Just two people remembering where everything began. Elvis pointed toward the sky, then toward Tommy. He smiled. Tommy looked up. There was a single yellow balloon floating above the neighborhood. Tommy laughed. He couldn't hear the sound, but Elvis could. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. Elvis placed his hand on the guitar. Tommy placed his hand beside it. Elvis played one gentle chord. Tommy closed his eyes. He felt the vibration. Then he smiled. Because years earlier, he had asked for something very simple. He wanted to know what music felt like. And somehow, a yellow balloon had led him there. The story wasn't really about Elvis Presley. It wasn't really about a guitar. And it wasn't even about a deaf child. It was about the moment someone stops looking at what a person cannot do and starts believing in everything they might become. Sometimes changing a life doesn't require $1 million. Sometimes it doesn't require fame. Sometimes it doesn't even require words. Sometimes all it takes is one person kneeling down beside a child and saying, without saying it, "I see you." And on that summer afternoon in Memphis, a little boy reached for a yellow balloon. He ended up reaching for something much bigger, a dream. And this time, he didn't have to reach for it alone.